Hi, guys. I thought it would be prudent to give a summarization on a topic I've been dealing with in my college education, specifically the Spanish Civil War. For those who aren't aware, Spain had a civil war in the 1930s, specifically from 1936 to 1939. As for the background, Spain had been declining precipitously since its colonization of the New World. Various failed policies and frankly just corruption and decadence in Spanish society resulted in the loss of the empire over time, with its largest failure being in the Napoleonic Wars when it lost all its New World colonies. From this, Spain had largely become a failed state, as it were. It was still functional, but it wasn't a great power in the way it used to be. In 1931, following a military dictatorship appointed by the king and various other failed policies to fix Spain's economy and society, the monarchy was ousted in an election and a republic was set up, the Second Spanish Republic. The first one lasted only a few months, several decades before this. However, with the removal of the monarch, Spain no longer had the central leader figure that had ruled it for centuries. And so there was a squabble in Spanish society over who would lead going forward. At this time, Spain, due to it not being very influential, it was being influenced by its neighbors, states like Italy, France, Germany, and Britain further away. And such, Spanish politics had become almost emblematic of the politics of Europe at the time. You had everything from fascists to communists to liberals to anarchists to any other major political group you can think of at this period of time. There were two large election cycles during the Republic's lifetime before the Civil War kicked off, one with a moderate left wing government and one with a moderate right wing government. Neither of these two governments were capable of stabilizing Spanish society, nor were they able to satisfy the needs or desires of their constituents. In 1936, an institution called the Popular Front was founded. This essentially was an alliance of the various left wing groups in Spain to get a supermajority to beat out the right wing parties. For Americans out there, the Spanish system was not like the American one where you have two big parties that clash. You had a more European system where you have multiple different parties that have to form coalitions together in order to push forward their collective policies. Unfortunately for the Popular Front, it completely collapsed after the election, meaning that they had won, but they no longer existed, meaning that the government was essentially a non entity. It was completely dysfunctional. While this was going on, various left wing groups, most notably communists and anarchists, were going around engaging in violence on the streets, although the nationalists and fascists also did the same thing. But the communists would do things like barge into churches, kill priests, destroy Catholic artifacts, and various other things. Due to all of this instability and fighting and all the rest, alongside major budget issues from the government completely being dysfunctional, the army decided to throw a coup. There had already been an attempted coup before this, I want to say during the moderate right wing period of Republican history, but that largely petered out because it didn't have any unified leadership. This revolt in July of 1936, however, was partially successful in that the army split. Half of it sided with the rebels, half sided with the government, thus creating the nationalists and the Republican factions. Nationalists were largely comprised of the army who had thrown the coup and various right wing groups that supported the coup against the center left government. You had conservatives, Christians, straight up fascists, middle of the road nationalists, and then various other groups. Basically, anyone you can think of who was center right in a Spanish context largely sided with the nationalists. The Republicans was everyone who was left of center. Everyone from liberals to social democrats to communists to any other left wing group you can imagine. From this, all of Spanish society completely collapsed. And from the American context, when we think of the American Civil War, there are very clear lines between the North and the South, the Union, the Confederacy. It's very obvious who's fighting who. And while there is violence behind the lines, it's not as though there are neighbors fighting each other across the entire country. There are solidly Union areas and solidly Confederate areas. The Spanish Civil War was a lot different, primarily because it wasn't a war where there's a whole nother rabbit hole there that I could make a whole nother video about, but essentially, rather than one half of the country trying to leave and the other half refusing to let them, this was a war where both factions want the whole country. So there was violence everywhere. Every major city had infighting between right and left wing militias and various other groups, alongside just random violence and chaos, which was just horrible. When the Spanish Civil War kicked off, the original plan by the coup stirs was that the army would overthrow the government and it would be a quick coup d'etat. It was never supposed to be a civil war. What ended up happening, though, was that the army's loyalty was split to where half the army sides with the Coosters, the nationalists, the other half remains loyal to the Republicans. At the start, the area the nationalists controlled largely consisted of northwestern Spain, that being the area of Old Castile, the area that the Spanish were based out of when they were doing the Reconquista, as well as Spain's African colonies, places like Morocco, Western Sahara, places like that. The Republicans were based out of largely old Aragon, cities like Barcelona, Valencia, while also holding the capital of Madrid. Soon after this started, the Germans brought in their Condor Legion, which is think a volunteer group, not a mercenary force, that airlifted the Army of North Africa from Africa back into mainland Spain. They seized the city of Seville and then marched north to link up with their allied forces in the northwest. From this point, the war largely grinds to a stalemate where neither side is able to actually push the advantage very much until the war drags on for 2 to 3 years with little to no territorial change. Most of the rest of the conflict would be decided by who was able to A, unite themselves against their opponent more effectively, and B, was able to marshal the best defense of what they had. As for the nationalists, on the latter point, they had something of an advantage because the nationalists were comprised of A, the military, but also the Army of North Africa, which was the most elite fighting force in the Spanish military at this point in time, due to Spain's war with Morocco some few decades before this. The Republicans, though, while there were army garrisons that sided with them, most of their army was largely comprised of various political militias. Things like the POUM, an anti-Stalinist militia which George Orwell fought for, the man who wrote 1984. There were also other militias such as the anarchist militias, the pro-Stalin ones, the various other socialist groups. Basically, imagine a war between a professional organized fighting force and a larger but also more disorganized band of militiamen. Behind the lines, the nationalists and the Republicans would both suffer from significant infighting. However, the nationalists were able to deal with this by coming to a compromise where the three big factions in their camp, the Carlists, which were monarchists, the Phalange, who were fascists, and then the normal nationalists, came to an agreement where they would restore the monarchy, but they wouldn't explicitly say who that monarch would be, which was vague enough that it allowed everyone to think that their group was going to be the one that would rule in the end. So the nationalists managed to consolidate themselves to deal with their issues after the war rather than having these petty squabbles during the conflict. The Republicans, on the other hand, would suffer from continuous infighting for their entire existence. The liberals would quickly lose power to the communists would then fight each other, the pro-Stalin communists would win out, they would crack down on the anarchists would attempt to reassert themselves, and then they would lose, and then eventually, in an ironic twist, the Republican Army couped the government, and the Republicans became a military dictatorship, which was the very thing that the nationalists had created to fight the Republicans. Due to this, the nationalists just won. They marched into Madrid, and that was the end of it. Following the end of the Spanish Civil War, the nationalists managed to seize control of the entire country and install a military dictatorship under the leadership of a man named Francisco Franco. Franco had been the leader of the Army of North Africa before the conflict, and through various other leaders being killed off on his side, he managed to become the supreme leader of the nationalist faction. He was the one who largely orchestrated the compromise between the Carlists, the Phalange, and his nationalists in the army to unify their side against the Republicans. As a result, he largely created a technically fascistic, but also not really, military dictatorship, where they used certain fascist ideas like autarky, the desire for economic self-sufficiency, nationalistic pride, and all that, while also not being very openly and outwardly aggressive in the same way other fascist states were, like Italy or Germany. And due to all of this, he managed to rule in Spain until his death in the 1970s. Once you hit the 1970s, 40 years after the conflict, it was clear Franco was going to die. He was old and he was going to die at this point, and they had to find a replacement. So Franco orchestrated that the monarch would return, and his protege happened to be the heir to the throne, and he would train him to become the new king of Spain. However, little did Franco know, that very same prince had been in contact with a high-ranking member of the United States government, and the United States government promised this guy that if he became king of Spain and liberalized the regime, they would welcome Spain into NATO and all these other various pro-Western institutions. And yeah, Franco dies. Alfonso, I think his name was Alfonso was the guy before him. Juan Carlos becomes king of Spain and immediately liberalizes the regime. He introduces democracy, rule of law, property rights, and he introduces Spain into the European system. The European Economic Community, NATO, various other things like that. There was a nationalist hardliner coup against him, but he largely managed to deal with that, stamp it out, and transition Spain into the decentralized monarchy that we know it today. And that concludes the story of the Spanish Civil War. Thanks for watching.